Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something that, honestly, almost every global company struggles with. Using legal documents that are fundamentally broken for international business.
It's a huge paradox, isn't it? You have these incredibly sophisticated global companies,
Right.
and they're operating on these often flawed, very local legal templates.
So our mission for this deep dive is to give you a shortcut to understanding this whole world of international legal standardization. We're going to see why the standard way of doing things, taking a template from one country and just rolling it out, is so dangerous.
And more importantly, why it needs to be replaced with a proper top-down blueprint.
Let's get right to the core problem the research identifies. Business is global now, from day one sometimes. But the contracts are, well, they feel stuck in the 20th century.
That's a great way to put it. The business model has evolved, but the legal framework hasn't.
And most of these etchers, they just take a contract based on one legal tradition, usually U.S. common law, and then try to force it onto the rest of the world, this whole one-size-fits-all idea.
And it's a fundamental failure waiting to happen. You have to remember how much business has changed. I mean, before 1950, a company was mostly domestic. Exporting was kind of an afterthought.
Just an add-on.
Exactly. Then, after World War II, you get the rise of the true multinational, where international business starts to get as big or bigger than domestic.
But today, it's totally different.
Oh, completely. So many successful businesses are just born global. Their entire model is international, and yet, like you said, the standard contracts have had a terrible time keeping up. It creates so much friction every time you enter a new market.
Okay, so if the old way is broken, we need a new plan. The sources we have propose this really robust top-down method for creating truly global templates. It forces you to look at the whole world first.
Yes. And the real intelligence of this method is that it makes you identify two things from the very beginning: the points of convergence.
The things that are basically the same everywhere.
Right. The universal parts of a contract. And then, crucially, the points of divergence. These are the areas where local laws have really strong opinions, and you absolutely have to adapt. It's a mapping exercise before you ever start writing.
Okay, so before we get to the solution, let's really unpack why the current situation is so bad. Why is this U.S.-centric model so sticky? Even a huge European company often ends up using these super detailed American-style contracts.
It's mostly a mix of history and, frankly, inertia. The U.S. legal market is just massive, and its contracts, especially in tech and finance, have become a kind of default standard. But to really get it, you have to understand the fundamental clash between the two big legal traditions.
Common law versus civil law.
Exactly. So think of common law, that's the U.S., the U.K., Australia. It's like a gigantic library of old cases on precedent. So when you write a contract, you try to imagine every possible thing that could go wrong.
And write it all down.
And write it all down in detail, relying on that precedent. That's why the contracts are so long.
And the alternative? Civil law.
That's most of continental Europe, Latin America, a lot of Asia. Their system is different. It relies on comprehensive laws, on legislation, codes and statutes to fill in the gaps. So their contracts are often shorter. They lean on the law itself to handle things like remedies.
That's a critical difference. So what happens when a lawyer from a common law system hands a 50-page contract to a civil law lawyer in, say, Germany?
Friction, pure friction. The German lawyer looks at this incredibly long, detailed document and realizes they can't just tweak it. The language doesn't map to their legal code.
So they see it as either missing things the local law requires, or even worse.
Or even worse, it contradicts the local code. So their instincts, their safe move, is to just throw it out and go back to their own local German template. And just like that, your global standard is dead on arrival.
It breaks before it even begins. But people have tried to fix this. The sources bring up one massive success story: the ICC's Incoterms.
Oh, Incoterms are the gold standard. They started back in 1936. They work because they define things for international trade, like shipping duties, in a way that is completely neutral from a legal standpoint.
But other attempts haven't worked as well. The ICC and others have tried to create full model contracts.
They have, and they are excellent resources. But they haven't seen that universal adoption. They haven't really solved that fundamental conceptual gap between the legal systems.
And on the common law side, you've got things like the ISDA Master Agreement for financial derivatives. That's a global standard.
It is, but that works because everyone in that specific market has basically agreed to play by common law rules. or they're forced to by the size of the markets. It just proves that offering a template isn't enough. The design process for that template is where most companies fail.
Which brings us to the core of the problem. It's not just that laws are different. We have to dig into the linguistic and the conceptual hurdles that make just translating a contract so risky.
And the first obstacle is the most obvious one, the linguistic barriers.
Right, this is where we get that great Italian saying, traditore, traditore.
Translator, trader.
Exactly. The idea that any translation is a betrayal of the original.
And in legal work, that betrayal isn't just poetic, it can cost you millions. Legal terms have so much historical baggage. Take a simple common law term like warranty. It has a very precise meaning, right? It's usually about the state of goods at the time of sale.
But if you translate that into, say, Spanish or French,
Yeah.
you'll probably use the word garantia.
You will, and there's the trap, because garantia is also the word they use for guarantee. And in those legal systems, that word might imply a much bigger obligation, like a duty to actively fix something, not just pay damages.
So by translating one word, you've stripped away all the precision and could have accidentally taken on way more liability.
You've created ambiguity where there was none. It's a huge risk.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating. Obstacle number 2, legal and conceptual gaps. So it's not just that the word is wrong, but the entire legal idea might not even exist in the other country.
That's when the whole thing just falls apart. If the concept isn't there, the clause you wrote has no legal meaning. Or it defaults to something you never intended.
What's a good example of that?
The best one is probably consequential damage. In common law, we spend pages and pages trying to exclude liability for things like lost profits that result indirectly from a breach.
Right.
But that specific legal concept, as it's defined in the US or UK, just doesn't exist in most civil law countries. Their legal codes are much stricter about defining damages, usually limiting them to direct and foreseeable losses. You can't contractually exclude a category of damage that the law doesn't even recognize.
So trying to put a U.S.-style liability clause into a French contract isn't just difficult. It might be completely unenforceable.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
And there are others. The idea of merchantability of goods is largely a common law thing. And even a term like force majeure, which actually came from the French Civil Code, has taken on a totally different meaning in common law contracts now. You can't treat them as the same thing.
So we have language risk, conceptual gaps, and I guess the third obstacle is just that things change. The problem of ever-changing legislation.
Precisely. Laws are not static. New legislation passes, courts hand down new decisions. If your global template is this massive static document, you're signing up for continuous expensive updates in dozens of countries just to stay compliant.
Wow. When you lay it all out like that, the old approach doesn't just sound inefficient. It sounds kind of reckless.
It's reactive. You're constantly putting out fires instead of preventing them.
Okay, so let's pivot to the solution. This is the big takeaway for you, the learner. This 6-step, top-down process that separates the global from the local right from the start.
And the first few steps are what make it so strategic. It all starts with step 1, defining project goals, or the scoping. Before you write a single clause, you assess how regulated the subject matter is in all your target countries.
Can you give us an example of how that pressure can vary?
Sure. Think about an employment agreement. That is highly, highly regulated everywhere. Every country has mandatory rules about worker protection, termination, benefits. Your freedom to create a global standard there is very low.
Versus something like a simple sales agreement between two businesses.
Exactly. A B2B sales agreement generally gives you much more freedom to set your own terms. That initial scoping tells you how complex the job is going to be. It stops you from assuming your own country's laws are the default.
It forces a global view from day one, which I guess leads right into the heavy lifting.
It does. Step 2 is identifying convergence and divergence, the mapping. This is where you actually build a matrix. You map the universal things like confidentiality, what the contract is about, dispute resolution against the things under high regulatory pressure.
So for a service agreement, you might find that termination clauses are pretty similar everywhere, but liability limitations are completely different depending on the country.
That's a perfect example. That map becomes your guide. It tells you exactly where your legal risks and localization costs are going to be. It's the foundation.
Okay, map is done. Now we start writing. Step 3 is creating modular building blocks, basically a library of pre-approved clauses.
Right, and this is where the language choice is so important. You have to use neutral, non-idiomatic terms. Just plain, simple, accurate language, no common law jargon.
But the really clever part of this step, it seems, is building the need for adaptation directly into the template, using placeholders.
Yes, that is the genius of it. So instead of just writing a generic warranty clause, you draft the core global language and then you insert a very clear flag, something like local law warranty language required.
Or liability limitation to be adapted for this jurisdiction.
Exactly. You are signposting it for the local lawyer. You're telling them this is the specific spot where you need to do your work. It makes their job surgical.
That's a huge shift. So once you have these building blocks, you move to step 4, writing the first draft templates.
And the key advice here is to start with your least regulated contracts. Get the process right on something simple before you tackle, say, an employment agreement.
And the sources say it's actually better to start from scratch, not from an old template. That feels counterintuitive.
It does, but it makes sense. If you start with an existing US or UK template, you spend so much time and energy trying to strip out all the legal and stylistic bias. It's often faster and cleaner to just draft a neutral version from a blank page using your new building blocks.
That does make sense, but it also sounds like a lot of upfront work. Is that why more companies don't do this? It feels easier to just grab the old template?
It feels easier in the short term, absolutely. But the long-term cost of managing the chaos that follows, the endless legal reviews, the fights over amendments, the risk of litigation, it far outweighs the initial investment of doing it right. This process pays for itself in streamlined compliance and lower risks.
Okay, that's a powerful argument. Let's get to the final steps. Step 5 is finalizing the first draft global template.
This is the reconciliation phase. You've gotten feedback from different countries. You take the required language from Germany, the specific definitions you need in Brazil, and you refine the global template. The final product has to be modular, clearly separating what's global from what needs to be localized.
And then the last step, step 6, translate and adapt templates.
This is where the local lawyers do their detailed work, but it should be incredibly efficient now. The key here is to bucket the work. You group countries by legal system civil law versus common law, and then by language family. The Romance languages, the Germanic languages.
And I imagine it's a whole other level of complexity when you go into Asia or the Middle East.
The completely different layer. You can't assume any of the European legal concepts or even linguistic structures will map. It requires its own dedicated approach.
But there's a benefit after all this, right, when you compare the finished country templates.
A huge benefit. You start to see new patterns of convergence you missed at first. For instance, within the EU, you can leverage harmonized EU laws to create a single EU version of a clause, rather than 27 different ones. It minimizes variation even further.
So to wrap this up for you, the learner, the big takeaway is that this one-size-fits-all model is fundamentally broken. Adopting this top-down process, where you account for all the linguistic and conceptual hurdles from the very beginning, is really the only way to build a legal foundation that's as global as your actual business.
That's exactly. And it makes you wonder, it brings up a really interesting final thought. If we know that these conceptual differences, like warranty versus guarantee, are so profound even for human experts,
Right.
what happens when we increasingly rely on AI and machine translation for these contracts? How does that change a lawyer's duty of care when the very language the machine is trained on is so inherently ambiguous and culturally loaded? Is technology just going to make the problem worse, or will it finally force us to become better, clearer drafters from the start?